next witness, please.
Defense calls Dr. Thomas Owens.
Do you swear affirm the testimony you shall give before the jury in the trial in this case speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your first and last name, and spell your last name loudly and clearly.
Thomas Owens, O-W-E-N-S.
Good morning, Dr. Owens.
Good morning, sir.
Where are you from?
Charlotte, North Carolina.
And what is your profession?
I am a forensic pathologist and medical examiner.
And tell us a little bit about your education to become a forensic pathologist.
I have a bachelor's of science, and where I did my pre-med certification, got all the classes that I needed to go to med school. When I got my biology degree, that came from the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. Got that in 1992. I then went to medical school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, got my medical degree there, graduated in 97. Did a year and a half of internal medicine training at Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Decided wanted to have a change in career path at that point, and took an interest in pathology. I then went back to Chapel Hill to the hospital there at the university, and did 4 years of anatomical and clinical pathology. When I completed that, I did a year of specialized training in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in North Carolina, which at the time was also on the shared campus with the hospital and the university. I completed that in 2004, and at that point moved to Charlotte to begin my employment at the Mecklenburg County Medical Examiner's Office.
And where are you currently employed?
At the Mecklenburg County Medical Examiner's Office in Charlotte.
And do you have any other businesses that you're involved with?
I do. I have a private consulting business that I started dabbling in some stuff in 2008, 2009, and in 2012, because I have a medical license and it's medical consulting, I had to register with the state and formed a PLLC, and that's Owens Forensic Consulting PLLC. I work with both prosecution and defense on both criminal and civil matters. A lot of my time is devoted currently within North Carolina to indigent defense services, those persons in the state who can't really, afford private attorneys, and the state appoints attorneys, and they also reach out to get second opinions from other experts.
And can you explain to the jury the difference between a pathologist and a forensic pathologist?
Sure. Pathology basically is the study of disease and suffering. A biopsy, taking an organ out, taking a blood sample, looking at, is it normal or abnormal? Is there cancer there? Is it just an inflammation? That's what pathology looks at. Forensics looks at the disease and suffering in people, but how it relates to either the diseases they have, the interaction with the environment, whether that be trauma, drugs, and figures out how an injury to a person came about or how they died. That's one of the big things. There are clinical forensics that deal with living people more, and then there's sort of forensic pathology when they overlap sometimes. But our bottom line is we're looking at the cause and the manner of death in a person. And that involves a number of things. Again, what diseases they had, what trauma they may have, what drugs or other substances are in their body, what were the circumstances around that, about how it came about or where they were found. The big categories, which a lot of people think of forensics, they think of things like homicides, gunshots, stabbings, things like that. That's actually a pretty small part of what we do. There are quite a number of natural deaths, persons who die suddenly and unexpectedly, relatively young age, don't really have a whole lot of medical problems. So we're discovering unknown diseases or unknown drug use or something like that that just wasn't in their history. And through the autopsy, through a very intimate, if you will, examination of the person, looking at their insides, looking at the substances inside of their blood, we can kind of help figure out the unknown and the why that person is dead. But probably one of the biggest areas that we deal with, which has been increasing over the years, are cases related to overdoses or drugs. So that's another huge category of what we deal with.
And are you board certified in clinical pathology?
I am.
And how about in forensic pathology?
I am.
Have you ever taught or presented on the topic of forensic pathology?
Yes, I have.
About how many occasions and what topics?
A couple of dozen times I've taught anything from blunt force injuries to gunshot wounds, injuries, stab wounds, sharp force injuries, general forensics for nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Trying to think anything else more specifically. I've taught about injuries from falls. I've had a couple of cases and a couple of presentations on deaths related to or not related to the use of tasers. So, a number of subjects that are all related to those kind of topics.
And have you ever published any works?
No, not really in an academic setting, so publication is not something that we're really into. It's more or less, getting the work done of the autopsies and finding the cause and manner of death.
And what is your current title in Mecklenburg County?
Currently, I am the Chief Medical Examiner and Department Director.
And you are here not in your capacity with Mecklenburg County, correct, but in your capacity for Owens Forensic Consulting?
That is correct.
Your Honor, or let me ask you one more question. Have you ever been qualified as an expert in forensic pathology in a court before?
I have.
And have you testified about matters relating to forensic pathology in that court?
I have.
About how many times have you been qualified as an expert?
It's somewhere over 100 right now.
And would that be mostly in the state of North Carolina, or is it in any other states?
Mostly, but I've also had occasions in a few other states, Tennessee, Virginia, I think Georgia. I haven't done anything in South Carolina that I can remember.
And are these courts state courts or federal courts or both?
Both.
And your testimony in these matters was, have you ever been eliminated as an expert by the court or not qualified as an expert by the court in any of those cases?
No.
Your Honor, the defense would offer Dr. Thomas Owens as an expert in forensic pathology.
Says the state.
Your Honor, we have no objection to his qualification as an expert in forensic pathology. We would have some questions and some objection if he is testified in forensic toxicology, which is what we understand.
What is he being offered as an expert in?
Your Honor, he's being offered as an expert in forensic pathology, but I believe the doctor would tell you that as an expert in forensic pathology, he also has to be an expert in interpretation of toxicological results. And if the court would prefer, we could allow the state to take Dr. Owens on voir dire to flesh out that.
He's accepted as an expert in forensic pathology.
As an expert in forensic pathology, Dr. Owens, do you have occasion to testify on the effects of drugs on people for whom you're performing an exam?
Yes.
And is that a small part of your practice, or is that a large part of your practice?
The testifying about the effects is probably a smaller part, but the interpretation and the involvement of toxicology, drugs and stuff on death is actually a big part of what we do.
And have you had training in that as part of your training in forensic pathology?
Yes.
How much training have you had?
During that year of training, I spent several, I guess, weeks on and off in the toxicology department for the state, which was also one centralized office in North Carolina, which was in Chapel Hill at the time when I did the fellowship. I've had years of just experience in my practice with Mecklenburg County. The forensic toxicologists are the persons who have the expertise in how to do the test, how to set the things up, how to make sure the equipment's running right, how to make sure that those results are true and believable and reproducible, so that when they publish something, they know it's real, that it's not an error or a mistake, that their equipment is, running right, and that it is the best kind of test to do to look for the presence of any particular kind of drug. They also sometimes provide guidance on what those numbers mean. But as a forensic pathologist, it is our job to incorporate those numbers into the entire context of the case, looking at both cause and or contribution of any particular drug or group of drugs to either the events that transpired, the circumstances around the death, or the cause of death itself.
And Dr. Owens, you were asked to review in this case a certain number of documents. Did you review the autopsy protocol performed here on Walter Scott?
I did.
And when you reviewed that protocol, did you make any conclusions about the injuries to Walter Scott?
Yes, sir.
And would it be safe to say the manner of death, the means of death of Mr. Scott was gunshot wounds?
Yes, that's correct.
And were there other wounds other than the gunshot wounds detected during the autopsy that would indicate a struggle may have taken place?
Yes, there were.
And I'm going to show you what's previously been entered into evidence as states 81, 82, and 96.
Okay.
Do you recognize those photos?
I do.
Have you reviewed them before?
I have.
And could we take a look at stage 81? Describe what we see in this photo, Dr. Owens.
This photograph is the left hand. We're looking at it sort of from the side. Obviously the thumb is facing us and the other fingers are kind of away and down toward the ground. This is one of the photographs that was reported to me as being taken from the scene of Mr. Scott. On that hand, we can see a couple of areas where the skin has been roughened up or scraped away, what we would call an abrasion. So it's superficial. It doesn't go deep down into the body, but the surface of the skin and the tissue just underneath that have been basically rubbed away or torn away. There's also a similar type injury that's present just below the hand, right on the wrist, sort of going around toward the back side of the hand. And I can point those out if you would like.
Yes, please.
So this is again, the injuries that are around the base of the thumb, here on the back of the hand, around the knuckles. And then we also have this injury here that is on the wrist area. And basically here the skin has been pulled away and the underlying tissue begins to ooze blood a little bit. And so we see the changes in these areas, which are clearly different than the remainder of the skin on his hands, excuse me, his hands and wrists.
And how about States 82?
States 82 actually shows the right hand, and the fingers are kind of cupped and the hand is facing up towards us. And we see, again, this was a photo taken of Mr. Scott's right hand at the scene. We see the leaf ground material in the background. There's a bracelet on the wrist. The main focus here would be the abrasions, the injuries, again, that are present on the hands. And I will step up and show those. There's an area here on the knuckle of the thumb where the tissue is, again, sort of torn or pulled away. There are also injuries here on the fingers and even a little bit here on the side of the hand. So again, these are areas where the hand has come in contact with something that was rough, that scraped or pulled or tore the tissue away from the surface.
And States 86? Pardon me, did we look at 81, 82, and 86?
We looked at 81 and 82, and then I'm sorry, this is actually 96.
Okay, I'm sorry, 96.
States 96 is a slightly different view from again, the right hand looking at the side of the hand and the thumb. It shows those same abrasion injuries that are present on the hand in a little bit different lighting. Again, you can see the injuries here at the base of the thumb, around the back of the hand near the thumb, on the knuckles, and the area here on the wrist.
And you can take that down, please. In addition to viewing those, did you view photos that were taken at the autopsy of Mr. Scott?
I did.
And just in general, were the photographs of the injuries consistent with the injuries that you viewed in these photographs here to the arm, to the hands and to the wrists?
Yes.
And I'm going to show you what's been previously identified, or entered as States 177, 176, 76, 77, and 78. Make that 75, 76, 77.
Okay.
And have you viewed those photographs before?
I have.
And could you just explain briefly to the jury, starting with 75, what we're seeing in those?
175 is the first of this series of photographs that were taken at the time of the autopsy. So you can see the metal table in the background. What we're looking at here is the left shoulder and arm coming down on sort of the bottom of the screen. And if you look in the top right-hand corner, that would be the chest. You can see the nipple. So his head would be sort of off to the right side of the screen there. And the focus here is on this area of the sort of back and side of his forearm just below the elbow. I'm going to point to that. Here, there are several little small, what are described more or less as linear, so they have more of a line shape to them. abrasion. So again, the surface of the skin has been scraped, cut, or rubbed away here on the back side of the arm. There's like this little group of at least 3, maybe a couple of smaller ones in there.
And let's look at 176.
.176 is the autopsy photo again. Now we're looking at that left hand, and you can see it's slightly different from the angle of the left hand that was shown at the scene, but I'm gonna step up here. All of these have a little marker for the case number, but this is the left wrist again, just a little bit back toward the back side. The abrasion that we saw previously, it now is a little more dried. We can't see the full extent of it. It kind of wraps around the arm a little bit back toward the side of the wrist, but it has a rectangular linear shape to it. We also see the abrasion at sort of the back of the hand near the thumb. We don't see as many of the abrasions up on the thumb here. You can see a little bit of the one on the knuckle of the first actual finger. And then we see a couple of little cuts or tears on the back of the hand.
And 177.
177 is not really the best orientation of a photograph. It's attempting to show the fingers and the knuckles. And it's not perfectly in focus. I believe the background's more in focus than the hand. But what's apparent, you can tell, is there's an injury. This is the left hand, and we're sort of looking at the knuckles as they're facing towards you. You can see the fingernails. Here on the third finger over, well, the ring finger, some people count the thumb as the first finger. It's a thumb. So first, second, third finger, there's an area of a defect here. It looks like a little red piece of tissue because what you're seeing is, again, an abrasion where the tissue's been torn away and so the top skin layer is gone.
And how about number 178?
178 is an autopsy photo. We're looking at the outside of the right elbow, so the part that's away from the body. Here at the bottom of the screen is the actual bend in the elbow. This would be the upper part of the arm. The chest is here, and the body going down this way. And so this would become the forearm area. And again, what we have is an abrasion, an area where the top layer of skin has been rubbed away, and the tissue underneath it can bleed a little bit, get red, and it kind of, at this point, it started to dry over and crust a little bit. So that, again, is an abrasion, and it's present on the outside edge of the right elbow.
Thank you. Did you also, in your review of the protocol, detect any injuries to the head and or face area?
Yes.
And could you describe those injuries?
Yes. On Mr. Scott's left side of his face, on his cheekbone, just under the eye, like where the bone actually is more prominent, kind of sticks out, he had a 1.5 by 1 inch abraded contusion. So abrasion, again, is the skin's been scraped, it's rough, the top layers are gone, and the contusion is an actual bruise. So not only is it scraped, but there was also enough of an impact to break the blood vessels and cause bleeding in the tissue around it to produce a bruise. The outside examination of the back of his head, you don't see anything. However, when the autopsy is performed, an incision is made across kind of the top back of the head from ear to ear, and the scalp is peeled back so that the skull can be opened and examined and the brain examined. When that was done, there was a 1/2 inch area on the left side of his head, just above and slightly behind his ear. And I'm going to point, that's called the parietal area. That would be approximately here, where underneath the scalp, next to the bone, there was an actual small bruise. So you didn't see it on the outside. Again, the tissue is kind of thick and the hair can occlude that. But when there's an impact, a blunt trauma from either a punch or a fall or something, hitting the head, the blood vessels are crushed against the skull and they bleed, and they're deep down against it. And it's what we call a subgaleal hemorrhage. It's down next to the bone, not up on the surface.
And as a result of your review of those photographs within the protocol and Dr. Tormos's report, did you reach a conclusion on whether it's likely or not that there was those injuries to Mr. Scott were sustained before his death, perhaps in an altercation?
Yes.
And what was that, what caused you to conclude that?
The injuries that we see at autopsy have a little bit of drying change to them. Those at the scene, and even, Dr. Tormos's description is that there is, again, vital reaction. There's redness, there's hemorrhaging, there's bleeding. These are not dried, tan parchment-like paper changes that would have happened after death. They've not had time to actually undergo healing changes. They're not scabbing over. So these are recent, appear to be relatively all in the same time frame in terms of the changes that are present to them, and we would be absolutely consistent with having occurred sometime shortly before death, certainly not after death, and could clearly be signs that there was some disturbance in all of those different areas to the skin, be consistent with some type of a struggle.
And did you see Mr. Schneck's presentation earlier this morning on the Yellow Brick Road and paint samples obtained and all that sort of stuff?
Yes.
Would the abrasions and cuts and contusions on Mr. Scott be consistent with those that might be caused by such a surface as asphalt like that?
Yes, asphalt is a rough surface that would cause scraping or rubbing of the skin and produce the abrasions.
Could you explain the medical concept of what the back is, the back and the front? Where do you as a forensic pathologist decide what is the front of a person, what is the back of a person?
Well, basically we have what's called the anatomical position. And if I will, I'll stand and sort of show you. The anatomical position would involve the hands down and the palms facing forward, standing perfectly straight. This is the anatomical position. So when we talk about this, the palm faces forward, so that's the front of the hand, and the back of the hand faces the back, so that's the back of the hand. The same thing with the forearms and the parts of the body. Now, when you look at the actual physical body, the chest and the abdomen and things like that, we have what's called the axillary line. If you start sort of in the middle of the shoulder or the middle of the underarm and draw a line straight down the sides, that's the axillary line. Anything front of that is the front of the body. Anything behind that is the back of the body.
Okay, thank you. As part of your review of the protocol, did you review the NMS Labs report that was produced for Mr. Scott?
Yes.
And I'm going to show you, I think that's been previously admitted for identification as State Exhibit 242. Do you recognize this?
Yes, I do.
And do you have a copy of that in your notes?
I do.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll have you go to the jury room. Yes, sir.
Your Honor, as I stated at the beginning of this, we object to any testimony by this witness as far as toxicology. We agree that he's qualified as a forensic pathologist. However, if he's going to be testifying about drugs and the effects of drugs, things that a toxicologist would be testifying to, we would review our objection. And also, Your Honor,
He's been admitted as an expert in forensic pathology, period.
yes,
So the objection is what?
any testimony that would be outside that scope as a forensic pathologist, we believe testimony, toxicology
So
testimony.
what is it that you want me to do? The witness was given an exhibit, asking, can he identify an exhibit, and you made an objection, so.
Well, we objected prior to any testimony and identifying it related to toxicology because we believe it would be improper for them to make any, provide any testimony.
What is the exhibit? What does it?
He was provided the drug reports, the toxicology reports that were testified to earlier. So essentially it would be, if he starts talking about what he's identifying, in the course of identifying it, it rings a bell, it can't be allowed.
All right, Mr. McKeon.
Yes, Your Honor. I think Dr. Owens testified earlier that toxicology is part and parcel of his role as a forensic pathologist, in that he not only determines the manner and means of death, but has to also identify contributing causes. He has testified that he is not a forensic toxicologist in that he does not design tests, he does not perform tests, but certainly in his role as a forensic pathologist, he's very familiar with, and in fact is mandated to be able to read the associated reports with that, including toxicological reports. He is able to opine, based on his training and experience in doing that, what various effects of drugs may be. We're not offering him as an expert in forensic toxicology. However, in his role as a forensic pathologist, he necessarily has to examine that. And I would point the court to Mizell v. Glover, 351 Southeast, South Carolina 392. In that case, there was some expert testimony gleaned from a podiatrist, and the podiatrist was commenting on the pain management treatment provided by an anesthesiologist for the same person. And the court ruled that that testimony was admissible because, as a matter of course, in his role as a podiatrist, he often dealt with pain management experts, and he was able to opine on the care of the pain management / anesthesiologist experts. And the court did allow that to go to the jury. They ruled that the jury had heard from a podiatrist who knew something about anesthesiology from his experience. They had also heard from the anesthesiologist itself, and the court said that the consideration of that goes to the weight, not the admissibility of the testimony, because the person testifying was in a better position than the jury to understand the facts and circumstances that the NMS report might present. And I would further say that, as a matter of course, it is an integral part of Dr. Owen's job as a medical examiner in Mecklenburg County to consider toxicology reports when he is in the performance of his duties.
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, Dr. Owens is direct up to this point. He's already testified that the cause of death was gunshot, not the presence of cocaine. So at that point, it would be relevant to his review of Dr. Tormos's report, because it has nothing
defense cites Mizell v. Glover, which is a medical malpractice case where the question is the limits of what one doctor can testify to in a medical malpractice setting. Contending that Dr. Glover breached a podiatrist's duty of care in failing to diagnose Ms. Mizell with RSD. Now, is that the issue before the court, or is the issue before the court an attempt to offer improper character evidence?
I think the threshold question is the testimony of toxicology, but obviously the next step after that for his testimony would be, if he's going to give an opinion as to behavior or the results of the drugs, it's going to have to, I don't see a way that it would not implicate the 403 character evidence that we've already filed motions that have kept out. So just in its entirety.
So you want me to anticipate where they're going with the testimony? That's why my base is at this point, he handed a report, says, can you identify it? You want me to go from there to review his entire testimony to determine if they're seeking to improperly attack the character of the deceased, or the victim?
We would think, Your Honor, our position is his testimony should be allowed. However, to avoid bringing the jury back in and then just objecting again as to what he may testify to.
Yeah, well, generally you object when there's something objectionable. He's qualified as a forensic pathologist. No effort has been made to elicit any type of improper testimony at this point. I mean, I understand your point of jumping the gun, but you know, he wasn't conditionally admitted. He was admitted as a forensic pathologist. He wasn't conditionally admitted in toxicology. Mr. McKinnon made the argument, but you know, all of that relates to testimony and what's proper and what's improper testimony, not the general qualifications of the witness.
We would ask to proffer his testimony this time.
All right, Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you. Dr. Owens, you have reviewed that toxicology report,
Yes, sir.
and I believe it states 242. And do you have your copy of it?
I do.
Okay, I'll take this one back if you don't mind. And for the benefit of council, could we put up 242? And Dr. Owens, what is the what are the results there, the findings based on this report?
This report lists the positive findings of the compounds that were present in the peripheral blood sample. And that is, they found the presence of cocaine, cocaethylene, and benzoylecgonine, and the actual levels are listed there.
Okay, and what is, I think we all know what cocaine is. What is benzoylecgonine?
Benzoylecgonine is one of the main metabolites or byproducts of the breakdown, the metabolism of cocaine. It happens through enzymes that are present in the liver, and it also happens indirectly through a process called hydrolysis that's dependent upon kind of like the pH, you know, the milieu of the tissue that it's in. It's a smaller breakdown. It's mostly done by the enzymes present in the liver.
And does that metabolite come from any other substance other than cocaine, or is it identified mainly with the breakdown of cocaine?
It is specific to the breakdown of cocaine.
Okay, and then what's cocaethylene?
Cocaethylene is a unique compound that is formed in the body when cocaine and ethanol, which is drinking alcohol, are present at the same time.
Now, as you look at these findings, if there had been ethanol present in the body, would that have been in the positive findings as well, to your knowledge?
It would have been due to the fact that it's listed as one of the analytes that they were looking for. And since they did not report it in the positive findings, then it was not detectable at their cutoff levels.
And can you state with any precision when, or pardon me, how much cocaine might have been consumed to come up with that number?
No.
And explain to us how cocaine is metabolized by the body.
Well, the cocaine enters the body, and it can happen in numerous ways, as we know, with either the cocaine being in a powder form or crack, the rock form where it's smoked. There's a paste that's often burned and inhaled. It can be injected. Cocaine is used medically as well. It had been in the past. It's how we developed lidocaine and other drugs that can be rubbed on and can numb a particular area. So it can be absorbed through the skin, through the nose, through the airways, through the blood vessels. How it goes in determines how fast it's absorbed and how quickly the effects come on, and then how quickly those effects go away. Because once it gets into the system, the cocaine travels through the body and through the liver, and then the liver are where these esterase enzymes break it down and start to produce the benzoylecgonine. The amount of drug that enters the body is cut in half, and it depends, on some specific things like the person, if they're a new user or a chronic user, if they've got other substances in their body. But the time frame is every 30 to roughly 60 minutes. Sometimes it could be a little bit longer than that. Half of the cocaine present in the body will be basically broken down to create things like benzoylecgonine. And then this goes on every 30 to 60 minutes. Then you get half of that half until basically it's all gone from your system.
So let's just say on the average, every hour, the half-life of cocaine is about an hour.
Yes.
So if one one can't really determine then when the cocaine was consumed or whether one was under the influence of that cocaine at a certain time before this measurement is taken?
Not really. I mean, you either have to have, you need some circumstances, either a witness to the event, or you can, certainly if you have circumstances in the history, like when somebody was doing something or they weren't doing something or they were not able to have access, admitted to the hospital, then you may be able to give a rough estimate of when the drugs were consumed. Again, you may not know how much they started with. You may not know if they just did it one time or if they did multiple doses, one after another over a period of time. But what you can say is the fact that there's cocaine that's detectable means that there has been recent use, because the half-life being, we'll say, average of an hour, whatever you start with keeps getting cut in half. So by the time you've gone through somewhere between 6 and 12 hours, which are 6 to 12 half-lives, you've cut the amount of drug in half 6 to 12 times. You're now at the point where the drug level is so small that it becomes undetectable by the methods that are used. So it's essentially out of the system. Now, there's still some effects from the drug in the body, and it's variable from person to person as to what that might be.
And what are some of the effects on cocaine for, say, a normal user of cocaine? What are the side effects of cocaine use?
Well, acutely, just like using it, cocaine is a stimulant. It actually increases the body temperature, the heart rate, feelings of euphoria or the high that people feel, because it affects certain neurotransmitters in the brain and stops those from being sucked back up. So you get an overload of these neurotransmitters, which is what causes the high. There are other effects on the body, including blocking sodium channels in the heart and in nerves, so that you get reduction to pain. You also get changes in the conduction of nerve potentials through the heart itself. And so, again, that can set up somebody for a sudden death from an arrhythmia in their heart, sort of like a short circuit.
And as part of your job as a forensic pathologist, is it important for you to know if a decedent had cocaine and/or cocaethylene in their system?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because depending upon the entirety of the circumstances, that either of those compounds, separately or together, could be the cause of death. They could also be either contributing to some other disease or some other drugs in the system. They may also be what we would consider more indirectly contributory, in that they are changes of behavior or physiology, so that a person's normal operation, the way their body normally behaves, is not behaving normally anymore. It may not have killed them directly, but it may have caused behavioral or physiological changes in the person.
Would it be important to you as a forensic pathologist when evaluating results like this to know if someone were a casual or a chronic user of cocaine?
Yes.
And are there tests to determine whether someone is a casual or chronic user of cocaine?
There are. I mean, it's not like a specific, here's the chronic drug test and here's the acute drug test, but there are ways to look at the presence of the cocaine and the metabolites like the benzoyl in different body tissues, and the ratios of those drugs can tell you if this is something that sort of happened all at once or if it's something that's been accumulating over time. If you've got several samples from different time periods that are positive, then you can start to make some kind of at least you can tell if someone's used before. You don't know if they're using every day unless you test them every day, but it does give you some sense of the history that, this person has used this or other drugs in the past, which may affect their tolerance to the drug. It may give you some insights into their prior behavioral changes that they've had when they've been using the drug. And the thing is about things like cocaine, you can build tolerance to the high, but any level for any person at any particular time could also kill them. And it's not like you're building tolerance to the drug not being lethal. So, I mean, all that kind of goes into effect because it's the first time they use, they could still die. It could be the 50th time they use, they could still die from the drug. But looking at those chronic versus acute can also tell you about other changes that will happen in the person, whether they're going to be more or less susceptible to certain diseases that come about as a sequelae of chronic administration. There's accelerated atherosclerosis, there's enlargement of the heart, there's a higher propensity for sudden death due to those aberrations that happen in the body, along with the sodium channels and the nerve potentials in and around the heart. There's also modifications that happen in the brain. The reason you get the high is because of the effect of the drug on the brain. And your body is designed to compensate for aberrations. And one of the things it does is if the high is caused by the blocking of the neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitters are now really high in the system and the body goes up, your body down-regulates other systems like the receptors. So it changes the profile, the way the brain tissue will look, the number of receptors that are present. If you look at drugs are deposited all through the body, even though we metabolize them and break them down and then they're excreted from the body, some drugs are actually stored in the body for periods of time in different tissues. So if it gets into, say, your urine, well, after you've urinated several times, it's gone, right? It's going to get less and less as you break it down, but then it's gone. However, if it gets into things that don't just go away immediately, like hair or nails, things like that that stay with us for a more extended period, the drugs will deposit in those samples. And by taking those samples and looking at them from one end to the other, we can look at deposits over time. So that's another one of the tests that you could do, is looking at hair samples from the root to the tip and looking for the presence of drugs that may have deposited as the hair grew over time.
And as a forensic pathologist, have you ever heard of the phenomenon of excited delirium.
Yes.
Have you ever done a medical exam or had a cause of death as excited delirium?
Yes.
And what is excited delirium?
Delirium is a term that's different from dementia. Dementia, we have to make sure we understand, is a progressive cognizant deficit. People lose the ability to think and do things through usually a disease process, a destruction of the tissue. Delirium is acute. It comes on quickly. It is a change in somebody becomes disoriented. They're not sure about their surroundings. So they're confused is basically what it amounts to. They don't respond to questions. They may not understand what's going on. Excited delirium is a very specific term that is used now predominantly in forensics, sort of in that community, or even in emergency medicine and stuff, where people have are under the influence of some type of excitatory drug. Cocaine and methamphetamine are the two big ones. And what that does is it causes the delirium. The person is not really aware of their surroundings. They're disoriented. They're often anxious. They may seem sort of paranoid. But they also become very agitated, aggressive, potentially violent. They will be resistant to pain. They seem extremely strong. So it becomes a struggle that can ensue from a person who is very confused and disoriented. And the system, it's like the fight or flight type system. Their body's revved up, and so they may go into a fight or flight type situation.
And you have had occasion to investigate arrest-related deaths before?
Yes.
And is this an important part of your analysis in an arrest-related death, that is the toxicological impacts on the victim of cocaine, methamphetamine, or other drugs?
Absolutely. During either struggles or arrest, or when someone's being subdued, or possibly even held in incarceration, they can have disastrous, if not lethal, effects from the medications or the drugs. And so that is obviously something that we're looking at in context of the entire situation.
And is it more likely, less likely, or does it make any difference if someone is an acute rather than a chronic user of cocaine if they experience this phenomenon?
It does make a difference.
And what's the difference?
The chronic use of cocaine is what I was talking about, where the body tries to compensate for the changes in the neurotransmitters. So with chronic use, the body typically alters the receptors and all this stuff for the neurotransmitters to try to balance out what the drug is doing. Those persons, not all of them, but there is a subset of persons who with chronic abuse, those changes predispose them to have a situation of excited delirium. Excited delirium doesn't really occur with acute cocaine use or just occasional recreational use, although a person can get sort of an agitated, paranoid, hallucinogenic state from very high cocaine levels. That's different than the excited delirium that comes about as a result of structural changes in the brain with repeated long-term use of cocaine.
Do you know if police officers are trained to recognize and be able to handle cases of persons who are experiencing excited delirium?
It would depend, I guess, on the departments and sort of what they've put into their training protocol. In the general answer is no, not really. They see someone who may seem agitated or anxious or aggressive, but do they know if there's underlying mental illness or drug use that's the cause of that? Not really. And again, it would depend on each department as to how specific. If they've had situations where that's come about, if they've had issues where they've looked at things like their interactions with persons in those situations and how they've handled that, then it may be something that they've started to have training on. It's like is this the kind of situation where you want to be hands-on? Do you want to, start deploying different types of use of force with these people? Do you want to bring in other types of, assistance? So it's completely dependent, and I, don't know exactly what training every department uses, but it's become much more, I guess, sort of in the limelight in the last few years that people have started to look at that.
And one could detect a chronic user if certain steps have been taken in the medical examiner's protocol, is that correct?
Yes, there's a much more, you would have the ability to make a determination one way or the other.
And one of those would be a frozen brain sample,
Yes, a frozen brain sample.
and one of those would be retention of hair for examination.
Yes, a sufficient amount of hair for examination.
Do you know if there was a frozen brain sample taken in this case?
There was not.
And was there hair retained in this case?
There was hair sample retained.
Was it sufficient for analysis for the purposes of seeing if there was a drug history that would indicate chronic usage?
There was not. It was only 6.7 milligrams of sample were collected. There may be some labs that can do it with less sample, but the lab that they use, NMS, requires 300 milligrams, and what was collected was 6.7 milligrams.
Did you know that the reason they noted that they collected that was for DNA purposes, the hair?
That's what I was told.
And is that a legitimate use for the collection of hair samples today?
No, it's not. There are much more productive ways to do DNA than a hair sample.
Would behavioral changes in someone who has been killed due to cocaine usage be relevant to your determination as a medical examiner of the contributory causes of death?
Yes.
And would it have helped your evaluation in this matter if we had had more information about the state of Mr. Scott's drug usage other than what we have, in other words, from the medical examiner's report itself?
Well, it certainly would allow us to do more examination looking into things like chronic drug use versus acute, and how that may have affected him in terms of his, his body and his mind and things along those lines.
Now, the solicitor has speculated in this case that Mr. Scott ran because he had an outstanding warrant for child support. Is it possible that that could also be a manifestation of some effect of cocaine use?
Yes, again, the excitatory stage, and there's part of that is the sympathetic system, that system that controls our being sort of hyped up. With the cocaine, there's the anxiety, the paranoia, this sort of restlessness that can come out in the sympathetic system is the thing that we call the fight or flight system. It's the thing that says, look, I'm excited, I'm revved up here, I'm either going to attack the situation or I'm going to run from the situation. So running or fleeing from, a situation is certainly consistent with, the influence of what something like cocaine in your system could cause.
And you are offering no opinion whether Walter Scott was a chronic cocaine user or not?
No, I cannot make that determination from the evidence that was collected or tested.
That's the property owner.
We don't have any questions from Dr. Fair argument.
All right.
Your Honor, the proper testimony from Dr. Owens related to the toxicology results, we believe is prejudicial under report. First of all, it was prejudicial under report of reanalysis is more prejudicial than probative. Scott, because in this analysis, if someone is a chronic user, if someone has repeatedly used, and if he goes through all that, and then at the very end just says, but I don't have enough to give opinions to whether he actually is a chronic user, you put that in front of the jury, it's confusing, it's misleading for the jury, also under that analysis.
Well, I mean, the state introduced into evidence the toxicology report. The state introduced the report, which was prepared by someone who did not testify. It was introduced, wasn't objected to. The witness yesterday testified, the bioelectrical witness testified yesterday that Mr. Scott had used cocaine. That was unobjected to by the state. Now you have a pathologist, forensic pathologist, who wants to testify concerning the meaning of cocaine use or possible impact of cocaine use. Now, so we have two separate questions here. One is whether or not he can testify to the first part of what he wanted to testify to regarding, he wants to testify to regarding the impact of cocaine on the body and his level of expertise in knowing what he's talking about. Then second, venturing into this phenomenon about excited delirium and whether or not that portion of it takes us way beyond his level of expertise, way beyond any evidence in this case, into pure speculation about the unknown, and whether speculating about this unknown is more prejudicial than probative. Do you agree with me?
Yes.
No.
That's what he meant to say.
Yeah.
So, Mr. McKinney.
Yes, Your Honor, just very briefly, the solicitor himself has speculated the reason that Mr. Scott ran. There are alternative reasons that Mr. Scott could have run, and ones that we actually have some evidence for, which would include the toxicological report that has cocaine use as well as coke-ethylene. And in addition, the state has prevented us from being able to make that determination because they didn't make the evidence preservation at the time it was necessary for us to be able to do that. So for the state to be able to offer an alternative explanation for him running while not allowing the defense a chance to explore other possibilities or get any testimony about it, puts Mr. Slager's liberty at stake without a chance to adequately defend it. And we would say that it would be relevant to the jury. It's not substantially more prejudicial than probative, and that the proffered testimony should be admitted for the jury's consideration.
Well, Rule 404 places limits on the testimony regarding the character of the victim. Of course, he's not here to speak. While on the other hand, giving the defense the right to present a full and fair defense, considering the rules of evidence and the right of both sides to have a fair and impartial trial. This witness can testify as to basic toxicology such that the majority of his testimony seeks to address. He cannot testify as anything regarding that Mr. Scott was under the influence of excited delirium and what that means, and it's pure speculation about the unknown. It's incompetent testimony. It will not be permitted by this court. So I exclude any testimony concerning excited delirium and what that means and the possibility that he might have been excited. Testimonies in the record as to the various impacts that someone might have that might be under the influence of cocaine. Of course, there's no evidence in the record that Mr. Scott was under the influence of cocaine at the time of the arrest. Evidence that it was in his system doesn't. No one knows when, though some generalized statement as to maybe it was recent. And the meaning of recent, within 30 days, 10 days, who knows? So I sustain the objection to that portion of the testimony, seeking to introduce this excited delirium theory into this case based on the evidence that's in the record. And I deny the motion with regard to his testimony, including testimony regarding the toxicology findings, toxicological findings. And we'll take a few minutes.